So today I'm going to be answering the question, does VR, virtual reality, belong at work? And it's a really important question I think we all should be asking. So I encourage you to follow along with me. But if you like this content, you like other content I make, which by the way, I'd recommend you check it out. Be sure to subscribe and like the video, share it with others who would benefit from it. Hey, I've got to do a shameless plug because otherwise people don't do things without a call to action. So with that, generative AI has basically sucked all the air out of the room when it comes to workplace technology. I cannot believe the number of conversations I'm in now that revolve around generative AI as though it's the only thing that any company is still working through or trying to make decisions around, which is unfortunate because if you look at what was in the conversation before, I mean, there were a lot of things in the conversation, but this naturally happens when something that powerful comes in and comes in that fast. Now, you also may be wondering, aren't you the learning person? So why are you asking, does VR belong at work more broadly? And I think it's a really important question to explore, especially for learning professionals. So if you're not a learning professional, well, hey, then this video is for you in terms of, hey, should I be thinking about VR? If so, how, why, what does that actually mean? But if you're a learning professional, this is a really important video for you because L&D has a history of sometimes pursuing technology without necessarily considering what else is going on in the workforce from a technology standpoint. Or we're trying to create our own infrastructure that in many ways competes with what the workers are already doing. Which, is there a time and a place for that? Yes. And you do it too much, then you end up with the situation we're often in, which is, well, how come nobody's participating or using our stuff? And it's like, well, it's because you chose to do stuff that nobody else was paying attention to or caring about. So that's why I'm going to this first. I will address the, hey, where does VR fit in learning? But I don't think we can answer that question until we get to a point where we've answered, does it fit in at work? Because if the answer to that is no, well, then it definitely probably doesn't fit into learning. So I'm guessing you probably can suspect where I'm going to go with, does it belong in work? And my short answer to this is, it depends. And I say it depends because there is so much complexity and nuance to this topic, as there is with so many things, that I don't think you can just answer it with a universal, of course it does, because work in and of itself is not universal. Now, let me get something straight right here. Let me kind of set things straight. I never, ever see a world, this dystopian world where everyone's sitting at a desk mindlessly with this headset on, kind of playing in a blank room with nothing. I don't see that happening, period. And if you look over the past couple of years, the desire for human connection has just continued to rise. So the idea that people are going to get to a point where they never want to take off a headset and they want to be completely lost and immersed in a digital world that looks and feels nothing like their real world, I just don't see that ever happening, even though a lot of the marketing you see, this is how it frames it up. I mean, some of the marketing I've seen is comical. You see people riding a bicycle with a VR headset, or you see, it's just not, in my mind, a reality I think we're ever going to get to, regardless of how the tech goes mainstream, regardless of how the hardware matures, things like that. It's just, I really don't see it going that where anywhere near that, let alone even close to it. So going back to that, then you ask the question, okay, well, if that's not the world we live in, then where does it fit? Because if it's not that, does it belong? And I still would say, yeah, I actually see a lot of places where it belongs in the workforce and where it adds a lot of tremendous value. So let's look at some of these, like, where does it actually shine then? Because if it's not dystopian, sitting in your headset all day long doing nothing but I don't know what, where does it stand out? And one of the things that I would say I've seen it be extremely powerful at doing well is it is an ultimate equalizer for hybrid teams. So when you look at a team that anymore, and honestly, every team, in my opinion, is now in this hybrid state. Because the reality is, even if you have teams who are in the office, air quotes, normally there's a mix of, well, so-and-so's working from home on these days and so-and-so's working from, and so the odds of everyone universally being in the same place at any given time just almost doesn't happen anymore. So the challenge you have is, well, some people are here and some people are over there and some people are doing this. VR does create this almost level playing field for everyone, saying it doesn't really matter where you are physically, we can bring you together virtually. And that is extremely powerful. And that may sound like not that big of a deal, but if you've ever been a remote employee or virtual for something that is even partially in person, you know that feeling of feeling like a second class citizen. I mean, I think anybody can relate to that. Now, obviously, there's this snap reaction of, well, then just go into the office. I don't think that's really a fair response to that. And I think this is where VR plays a really critical role when you say, look, like, let's just deal with the reality. The days of everyone being in the same location and being able to count on that with any level of consistency are gone. And VR can be a great bridge for saying that's not a threat. So instead of trying to do all these workplace gymnastics to try and force something that is an almost impossibility, hey, why don't we consider some technology that can actually make it not matter? And then you eliminate the argument. Now, I'm not going to get into the virtual work thing. That's a different video. I think I actually made one, so go check that out. But the reality is, this has a lot of potential for that. And I've seen it firsthand, and I've used it I have a hybrid team myself. I've used this to bring people together for a shared experience. Now, I'm going to tell you where not to do this and not how not to do it, because I've seen people do that wrong. And then they go, well, see, VR does not actually work for that. And I would say you're doing it improperly. But this is that great equalizer for that. The other thing that I would say is that it is extremely powerful for anything that comes to an experiential activity, and not just in the sense of trying to recreate what you could do in person, but try and think, what are the limitations and the barriers that you may have in reality? So when you think about some of these activities, like experiential activities, a lot of times you'll think team building. Oh, team building can be really great. It depends. Like, is the way you're structuring team building based on experience? And when I say experience, actively doing something. If you're trying to recreate a team building where everybody's sitting around a table doing some desktop activity, using VR would not make any sense for that. It would be actually a detriment, in my opinion, to that kind of team building. Now, if you're looking for some sort of team building, just as an example that I've done with my teams, we've done, I think the game's called Cookout, where I have done team building activities with my leadership team it's a goofy game. You're building sandwiches, but it forces you to use team building type thing, communication, actual timing. There's some fun and camaraderie that comes along with it. And it's very experiential because you're actually building these sandwiches. You're doing these different things. That's not something, quite frankly, that I could do on a regular basis, even in person. So I think this is one of those, when you look at it this way, you could go, well, you could do that in person. Yeah, I probably could, but the coordination of trying to find a restaurant that would let us build sandwiches, going to the grocery store if we weren't going to go to a restaurant, right? You start thinking the logistics. You're like, yeah, we could maybe do that once. But I'm able to quickly spin that up on an almost weekly basis with leadership teams to say, hey, we need to continue working on this. We need to just spend some time collaborating and having some fun together. And you live in Texas, you live in Florida, I live in Wisconsin, right? We're all over the place. There would be no way to logistically do that in any other way other than VR. And it's a very experiential, hands-on way of doing it. So when you think about this, that's extremely powerful. When it comes to simulation and prototype design, I know a lot of folks who work in the design world and they're doing prototyping of real models. VR is fantastic for being able to quickly replicate and physically manipulate these different models and being able to work through this stuff in a way that you honestly could not do in reality. So I think that's a really important call out, that there are actually places where I very much would argue that VR shines above analog experience. So even if you could do it in an analog method, I would say VR in some ways, in some cases used right, is actually a superior experience, especially when you think about speed and scale. I think about 3D modeling, the ability to 3D model and manipulate 3D models with your hands physically. you can do that better and at quicker and with more scale in VR than you ever could. Now, this gets to the question then of, okay, so then where does it not? And if you listen to my examples of where does it work really well, well, I would say with few exceptions, the average worker's day-to-day work activity does not make sense in VR. And so while I'm a big tech enthusiast, I love VR. I think there's a ton of opportunity for it to do some really powerful, incredible things for good. I also look at the average individual and the majority of how they spend their time. And I would go so far as to say, yeah, that actually doesn't really make sense for virtual reality. Now, there's some people who would argue against that, specifically the marketers of the VR companies, because you see ads all the time like this. Oh, imagine if you could just sit at your imaginary desk and have 300 monitors up on the wall and you took all your meetings in VR. And I know that was a big thing where, hey, you could take your meetings in VR. Yeah, you can. But in many ways, when you really think about the user experience and what it takes to make sure your headset's charged and charge your headset and then put it on and oh, you got to load the system and get into it all for a meeting, it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. And that's been my experience. Now, where I would say there's a difference here is if this is going to be a very dynamic, hey, this is the kind of meeting we're putting post-it notes on the wall and we're interacting with each other. We need these hallway conversations with spatial audio where we can talk to one another type of a thing. When you actually break down the experience and go, what really is the purpose of this meeting and what are the things that we really need to emphasize here? There are going to be times when you go, you know what, VR is a superior experience for that. And there's going to be other times where you go, honestly, we'd be a lot better off just jumping on Zoom real quick and pulling up Miro and doing a quick activity, because that's really the goal of what we're trying to do. The whole spatial, audio, the whole manipulative, trying to touch and feel things. It's not really at the core of making things successful. And I think that's sometimes where we see problems in this is that because it's cool and because it has this wow factor, that can lead people to go, yeah, we really should do this and it's a better experience. And I would say, nah, when you actually factor in some of the detracting components of it, sometimes it's actually making for a worse experience. And so going back to this, I think this is a really just important piece to consider is, does VR have a place in work? Yeah, it does. But we have to think critically of what are we trying to do with this time and space? And again, my take on it is we're never going to be in this dystopian universe where we're all in these devices already. So we can just assume, oh, well, it's really easy for people to just switch apps. Probably not. So you've got to think of that whole user experience and go, is what we're asking them to disrupt in their work experience worth why we're bringing them into this experience? So then that leaves the question, okay, so you've framed up some good reasons to do it and some not so good, which is actually a large majority of the time. Where does that leave us? Couple considerations that I would put out there for anyone considering the question of, hey, where does VR sit? There continue to be some barriers to hardware access for the general population. So you need to understand this. The idea that everyone is going to have a headset and be comfortable with it and have it charged and right, the kinds of things you can just assume about a smartphone, you can just kind of assume, well, I can just assume that people have this. We can't do that with headsets yet. Will we get there? I don't know. I'm really not sure. I'm watching the hardware space closely. But I think those are real barriers that you have to take into consideration. So when you're asking the question, is the juice worth the squeeze? You have to factor all those other things into play. And the access to hardware, and I'm not just talking, do they have one? It's, is it readily accessible? Are they familiar with it? Is it updated, right? All those other questions, you have to ask those questions. Now, I will also say there is some general resistance to wearables. They can be heavy, they can be a little bulky, they can kind of make your neck sore. Some people get motion sickness. That said, I think sometimes the motion sickness is more to do with how people are introduced to it. That's another conversation. But you just have to recognize that we aren't at a state, back to the smartphone analogy, where people just are 100% comfortable and familiar with this technology. So asking someone to put a face mask on You just have to know there's barriers to it. And there's always going to be the people that will do it in a heartbeat. And then you're going to have the vast majority that are a little bit hesitant, nervous, uncomfortable, that you're going to have to go, okay, so is what I'm asking them to do so important that it overwhelms those? And the unfortunate part is, I think a lot of times people jump to the conclusion that no, it's not. So we're not going to explore this. And I think that's a mistake. I will just tell you right now, if you assume that these barriers and the barriers to access, the resistance to the hardware just means universally it's never worth it, I will tell you right now you're missing out. And I'm going to challenge you to change that attitude because it is highly, highly valuable when used in the right situations with the right expertise. So it's really about balancing that scale of I recognize there are these barriers that I have to account for. So what's over here in terms of the what am I getting out of this? If I'm just asking people to meet in VR instead of in Zoom for a general meeting, those barriers are just going to totally outweigh the benefits. Now, if we're talking about, like I said, a team building activity where you've got folks spread all over, you have this well architected experiential activity, and you go, well, okay, so getting someone a headset, helping them over the learning curve, but we don't have to logistically plan and coordinate and budget for all this other stuff. Well, now suddenly now I totally forgot these are the barriers. Right now, the barriers, right, the value starts to go this way. And I would say there are definitely instances where the scale is in favor of the tech. But you can't just pretend these barriers don't exist and say, well, VR is good for everything. It's not. But you also can't say, well, VR is good for nothing because of these barriers. There are times that that value prop is big enough to do it. And that's the point that I really want to emphasize is that there is real value to this. And I think it's unfortunate that generative AI in many regards has sucked the air out of the room and stopped a lot of these conversations. Now, what I can tell you is the conversations have not stopped. They're still happening. And I talk with execs all over the place that still are pushing this forward. It's just we're not hearing it as much. It's not in talk nearly as much. And the reality is the hardware's in a bit of a flux state right now. And that is just a reality of things. You know, we're not at the state where, like an iPhone, you can be 5 generations behind. And for the most part, we can still count on the thing doing what we need it to do regardless. The hardware is not there. We're also in this mix of like, are we going to go full VR? Is it going to be VR, AR, hybrid? Like, how's that all going to work? So there's some questions right now, but the conversation is still very much happening. And I talk to people on a very regular basis who are having wild success with this. So if you're watching this going like, I just don't know that it's for us, I would challenge you that you may be wrong in that. And you may be missing some real opportunity while at the same time acknowledging your hesitations and concerns are valid. And you should be thinking critically about this and not just chasing it for the sake of, hey, it's cool and it's pseudo popular. You know, how can we make this work? So what does that leave us to do? And I think it's an important question because, you know, I've like many of my things, I talk about the nuance and complexity of it. And there's never really a straight answer of, so does VR belong at work for me? Well, that depends. Does it belong at work? Yeah, it absolutely does. But if you're looking at this thinking, so what should I do? My first point would be don't ignore the trend. Just because it's fallen off the main stage, don't assume that it's gone and that it's past. And oh, yeah, that was a thing that happened in COVID because everybody was stuck at home. And, you know, now that things are kind of returning to normal, nobody's really going to care about that. That would be a mistake. Quite frankly, that would be a mistake to make that assumption because that is absolutely not what's happening with it. It is still very much moving and moving intensely. And the other thing you have to consider is the next generation of workers, our youngest generation, they're going to be much more familiar and have leveraged this technology far more than the generations that are in the workforce now. So, like many things, what we run the risk if we just ignore this is, it's never going to happen. There are going to be people coming into the workforce going, what the heck? Like, why do we not get a headset as part of our standard tech suite? And you're going to need to be prepared for that. And they're going to have expectations around some of this stuff. So we need to keep, again, think past the end of our nose of like, well, right now I don't see it. Next year I don't see it. Play the long game with this. Now, if you're thinking about this, if you have an interest, if this is something you're unfamiliar with and you have some capacity and some budget, honestly, I would recommend dropping a couple $100, depending on the size of your team. You can start with a small subset of it, but dropping a few $100s on these things for your team to experiment with, to me, is a very small investment for a very rich return. And I would encourage it for anyone to take a little bit of time if you can do it. Now, granted, you need to have someone that is committed to identifying opportunities and leading that. I intentionally created a role in my organization for someone who had that capability and that desire to figure this out. And they've been fantastic at not only thinking, by the way, if you're thinking VR is only in a headset, that is just not an accurate statement. There's a lot more you can do with it. But so I was committed to saying, I need to have somebody that can push the bounds of what this technology can do. Now, maybe you can't hire a direct dedicated headcount to it, but you probably have someone on your team who's very tech savvy, very curious about the tech, who would be a great candidate for, hey, can you explore this? Can you see where might there be some breaks in our operational processes that we could do a better job if we used VR technology? And let them do it. And again, you can start with a small segment of stuff. It is a great stretch assignment. And normally I hate stretch assignments, but if you've got somebody who's really tech savvy and loves exploring this stuff, this can be a really great way to go, look, I'm going to incentivize you. I'm going to get you a headset. There's a handful of us on the team that are going to have them. I'd love you to explore, like, what are some different ways we can be thinking about this? And this is not a big investment. We're not talking tens of thousands of dollars on this kind of stuff, just to experiment and play with the possibilities. Now, if that's outside your realm, if you're going, this isn't for me, like individually, you probably still could. And I'd recommend you do it. Drop a couple $100 on one just to familiarize yourself. But if you're going, the thought of doing this for like a group of us, even a leadership team, things like that may feel overwhelming. There are some really great organizations that offer rented solutions that also come with the facilitated experience. Because I will tell you, there is a learning curve on this. It's not something that you can just go, hey, we bought some headsets, let's do an offsite. There's a real learning curve associated with this. And that may be, if you aren't someone who's super familiar with the tech, it's worth doing it with your team, even for the experience, to say, hey, why don't we do a team building or leadership event with at least a partial VR experience that's built into it so that people have an opportunity to experience it. You want to talk about something that people struggle with conceptualizing until they've done it. This is very much one of those things where people think they get it until they experience it. And then they go, I guess I really didn't get it. So this may be a way that you can introduce that. And your people they may surprise you. In fact, you will likely be very surprised with the possibilities when you get in there and you start going, whoa, we could do this. Whoa, I didn't think about this. Whoa, this would be a possibility for this. Now, what I would challenge and caution you on is that can lead you to chasing the shiny object. So just be careful with that. There's some really cool stuff with this. But you got to be careful that you don't get so excited about it that you end up chasing it because it's cool. You really have to think, hey, is the juice worth the squeeze? And there are definitely instances where I would advocate it absolutely is, but it's not for everything. And just because something's cool doesn't mean it's adding value. So that's my take on the question of, does VR belong at work? But I'm actually curious. What do you think? Now that you've heard this, what's been your experience, or what have you seen? And what's your thoughts on, does it belong at work? And does it have a role in where things are going? Let me know.